sleeps.
Welcome, my fellow fear enthusiasts. The doctor is in, and tonight I have another terrifying tale for you. The intake room felt colder than it had an hour ago, the air thick with the smell of wet plaster. I sat across from the patient, a man named Arthur, but my attention kept drifting to the visitor sitting in the plastic chair beside him. He was a man in a charcoal suit, clutching a bouquet of lilies that were already beginning to brown at the edges. Though the petals didn't wilt, they simply darkened, turning the color of dried arterial blood. "She's waiting for you at home, Arthur," the visitor whispered. His voice was a thin, reedy sound, like wind passing through a crack in a tombstone. Arthur stared at the floor, his hands locked in his lap. "I don't know where home is anymore. The address, the numbers don't look right when I write them down." I leaned forward, my pen hovering over my clipboard. My pulse was a frantic bird against my ribs, a physiological response to a situation that defied my clinical training. I shifted my weight, trying to catch the visitor's eyes, but he remained focused entirely on Arthur. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sterile, sound-dampened room. "Sir, I'm afraid visiting hours concluded at 4. Who are you here to see?" The visitor turned his head slowly. The movement was wrong, too smooth, as if his neck lacked the friction of bone and sinew. When he looked at me, I realized with a jolt of primal terror that he was not looking at me, but through me. His eyes were wide, milky spheres devoid of pupils, reflecting the flickering overhead fluorescent lights like polished marbles. "I am the closure he requires," the man said. I looked down at the floor, searching for the anchor of reality. My own shadow stretched long and dark toward the door, cast by the harsh light behind me. I looked for the visitor's shadow. There was nothing, not even a slight darkening of the scuffed linoleum beneath his chair. He sat in a pocket of absolute impossible lightlessness. I glanced at Arthur, and my throat went dry. The patient was beginning to shimmer. The edges of his face, the slope of his shoulders, the very texture of his hospital gown, all of it was vibrating at a high, erratic frequency. He looked like a film reel skipping frames, stuttering in and out of existence. Every time he flickered, he seemed to grow thinner, his features blurring into a generic, featureless mask of skin. "Arthur," I stood up, the chair scraping sharply against the tile. "Arthur, look at me." Arthur didn't hear me. He was staring at the lilies in the visitor's hand. As I watched, the flowers began to bleed. Not water, but a thick, viscous ink that dripped onto the floor, pooling into shapes that looked disturbingly like human silhouettes. "He's almost gone," the visitor said, his voice dropping into a register that felt like a vibration in my own skull. "The ward demands a balance, doctor. For every memory kept, one must be erased. He has been here so long that he has run out of currency." "Who are you?" I demanded, though my hands were trembling so violently I had to drop the clipboard. It hit the floor with a deafening crack. The visitor smiled. It was a wide, hideous expression that stretched too far across his face, exposing teeth that looked like serrated shards of porcelain. "I am the record of what is no longer true." Arthur gave a sudden, sharp gasp, a sound of pure, unadulterated erasure. His entire body convulsed, his eyes rolling back until only the whites were visible. And then, with a sound like a shutter clicking on a camera, he vanished. Not into thin air, he simply ceased to be. The chair where he had sat was empty. The visitor remained for a heartbeat longer, his milky eyes locked onto mine, his lack of a shadow casting an oppressive, inverted weight onto the room. Then, he too dissolved, not into dust or smoke, but into a series of jagged geometric lines that folded in on themselves until they were nothing more than a ripple in the stale air. I was alone. I stood frozen, my breath coming in jagged, shallow gasps. My scientific mind, the bedrock of my career, was frantically trying to build a narrative. Mass hallucination, a gas leak causing temporal lobe seizures, carbon monoxide poisoning. But the silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the weight of something that had just consumed a life. I rushed to the door, fumbling for my keys, and ran to the administrative station. The hallway seemed longer than before, the walls closing in, the paint peeling away to reveal a subsurface of damp black timber that looked like the rib cage of some great buried beast. I reached the filing cabinet, my fingers shaking as I pried open the drawer marked A. I pulled out Arthur's file, my breath hitching as I flipped it open to verify what I had just seen. The folder was empty. I tore through the papers, but every single sheet was blank. No intake date, no diagnosis, no family history, not even a smudge of ink. I checked the next file, and the next. Every name I had committed to memory over these last weeks, the patients I had interviewed, the case studies I had meticulously documented, had been stripped clean. I looked at my own clipboard, the one I had dropped in the lounge. I picked it up, expecting to see my own notes, the ink I had laid down with such precision and arrogance. The paper was pristine white. A cold, dead sensation bloomed in my chest. I wasn't just losing the patients, I was losing the evidence of my own tenure here. The asylum wasn't just housing the broken, it was digestion. It was a colossal sentient machine designed to chew through identities, turning men into memories and memories into nothing at all. I slumped against the desk, the weight of the realization crashing down on me. I wasn't the observer, I was the next course, and as I stared at the blank page, I felt my own grip on my history, my childhood, my medical degree. The face of the woman I once loved start to stutter, flickering like a failing light bulb in the dark. The air in the visitors' lounge was stale, tasting of ozone and wet wool. Elias stood in the corner, his fingers twitching against the cold leather of his medical bag. His heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs, a sound far too loud for the silence of the room. Across from him, the visitor, a man in a charcoal overcoat, his posture rigid and impossibly precise, leaned toward a patient whose name Elias could no longer recall. The visitor's hands were clasped, white-knuckled, on the tabletop. "I brought the letters," the visitor murmured. His voice was a flat, synthesized rasp, devoid of any genuine emotional inflection. "Everything you asked for. The dates are all correct. The memories are intact." The patient, a gaunt man with graying stubble, looked up. His eyes were wide, vacant, and shimmering with a strange bioluminescent haze. As he shifted, his physical outline flickered, his skin turning translucent for a heartbeat, before snapping back to reality with a sickening pop of displaced air. Elias stepped forward, his clinical instincts clawing for purchase. "Excuse me, this hour is strictly for therapy, not external correspondence. Who are you?" The visitor did not turn. He didn't even blink. He remained frozen in that predatory, forward-leaning crouch. Elias reached out to grasp the man's shoulder, intending to pull him back, to assert the authority of his white coat. But as his fingers entered the space where the visitor's shoulder should have been, he felt nothing but a sharp, biting cold, a vacuum that sucked the warmth right out of his fingertips. He looked down at the floor. Beneath the visitor's polished Oxfords, the linoleum was bare. There was no shadow. No light from the overhead flickering fluorescent tubes dared to touch the space behind the man. "He's not real, Elias," the patient whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over gravel. The man's face began to blur, his features melting like wax near a flame. "He's the ink, he's the paper, he's the erasure." The visitor finally turned. His face was a smooth, featureless oval of pale skin, except for a jagged horizontal scar where a mouth should have been. The visitor stood, his movements jerky, like a reel of film skipping frames. He dissolved not into mist, but into a flurry of black oily flakes that drifted upward and vanished into the ceiling tiles. The patient didn't scream. He simply slumped forward, his forehead striking the table with a dull thud. When Elias rushed to his side, checking for a pulse, he found only a shallow rhythmic vibration under the skin, as if a clockwork mechanism were winding down inside the man's chest. "Hey!" Elias shouted, though there was no one in the hall to hear him. "Nurse Shaw, someone get in here." He fumbled for his chart, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the clipboard. He flipped to the patient's file, desperate to identify the man, to hold on to a name, a diagnosis, a fragment of human history. He stared. The paper was pristine, not empty. Pristine, It was as if the page had never been touched by a pen, never subjected to the indignity of a clinical observation. He turned the page. Blank. The next. Blank. He lunged for his bag, dumping his notes onto the table. Every page, every carefully documented case study, every scribble of his own hand from the last month, it was all gone. The ink had vanished, leaving behind only the ghost-white indentations of his pen, a map of thoughts that no longer held meaning. "No," Elias whispered, the word hitching in his throat. He grabbed a pen from his breast pocket, intending to write something, anything, to anchor himself. But as the nib touched the paper, he felt a sting in his thumb. He looked down. The skin of his hand was turning gray, the texture shifting, becoming porous and dry, identical to the paper he held. The pen didn't leave a mark on the page. It bled a thin, black, viscous fluid that seeped into his own pores. He was being written over. The hallway outside the lounge began to hum, a deep tectonic groan that vibrated through the floorboards. The walls seemed to draw breath, the yellowed wallpaper rippling like a lung. Elias looked back at the patient, but the chair was empty. The man hadn't left. He had simply ceased to be a subject of the record. He had been archived into the architecture. Elias backed away, his boots scraping against the linoleum. He stumbled into the corridor, his mind fracturing under the weight of a singular, horrifying realization. The asylum didn't just house patients, it digested them. It stripped away their identities, their pasts, and their records, recycling the biomass into the dark, sentient fabric of its own existence. He was not a doctor. He had never been a doctor. He looked down at his white coat. The name tag, Dr. Elias Vance, was fading, the letters rearranging themselves into a series of jagged, illegible scratches. He reached for the door handle to the hallway, but it was gone. In its place was a smooth, seamless expanse of wall. "Thorn," he screamed, his voice sounding distant, as if shouted from the bottom of a deep well. "Thorn, you bastard, show yourself." The only response was the sound of 1,000 pens scratching against paper, a cacophony of writing that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the building. Elias slumped to his knees. The pen in his hand grew warm, then hot, searing into his palm until it became a part of his skeletal structure. He realized then that he wasn't an investigator anymore. He was the next entry. He was the story that was currently being drafted into the annals of Blackwood. He tried to scream again, but his mouth felt full of dry, dusty paper. He watched, helpless as his own memories, his childhood home, the smell of his mother's perfume, the sight of the sun over the university quad, began to flicker like the patient's, dissolving into gray, flickering light, and then finally into nothing. The room darkened, the flickering lights overhead dying one by one, until the only thing left was the sound of the ward, waiting, breathing, hungry for the next syllable. Your story ends here. The nightmare doesn't. If you want more terrifying tales, like, comment, and subscribe to Dr. Never Sleeps. The lights will go out, the silence will return, and when it does, listen carefully. Another story is about to begin.